Hank watched Sarah walk away, the flight attendant directing her toward the rear lavatory. As she passed the man 15 rows ahead, she lightly brushed his shoulder, a silent, knowing touch that split my world in two. He watched her go, a cold certainty settling in his gut, then turned back to see the man's gaze follow her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. My 10 years vanished into thin air. The life Hank Miller built over the last decade felt as solid as the foundations he poured for new homes across the Minneapolis suburbs. 10 years with Sarah Peterson, his music teacher wife, had been a steady hum of contentment. Their small St. Paul house, always neat, always smelling faintly of Sarah's lemon polish and the lingering scent of her piano lessons, was home. Discussions about starting a family had become more frequent, less hypothetical. He loved her with the quiet, unwavering devotion of a Midwestern man who knew what he had and appreciated it. The annual winter trip to the Bahamas, a week away from the bitter Minnesota cold, was their tradition, a time to reconnect, to forget the slush and gray skies. It was Hank's off-season, a chance to really slow down. The Minneapolis-St. Paul airport security line was a familiar bottleneck. Hank stood behind Sarah, watching the routine choreography of shoes off, laptops out. He noticed a man in a navy polo shirt, a few people ahead, glancing back repeatedly at Sarah. Not a quick, dismissive look, but a lingering one, almost possessive. Hank, a big man with a calm demeanor, felt a subtle shift in the air, a prickle on the back of his neck. Sarah caught the man's eye, and in a movement so quick, so subtle, it was almost imperceptible. Her hand flicked downwards, a small, dismissing gesture. Not now. Hank's gut clenched. He knew that signal. A cold wash spread through him, instantly chilling the warmth of their vacation anticipation. They moved through security, collected their bags, and headed for the gate. The man, Hank noted, was ahead of them in the terminal. When they boarded the plane, Hank's eyes scanned the rows. His stomach dropped. There he was, Chad Olson, in seat 12B, 15 rows ahead. Hank tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was a coincidence. The world was small. People traveled. Sarah, usually insistent on a window seat, suddenly announced she felt a bit queasy. "My stomach's been acting up all morning, Hank. I think I need the aisle today, just in case." Hank, though confused, was always obliging. He swapped seats with her, settling into the window, pulling his Minnesota Twins cap low over his eyes. He pretended to doze, but his senses were acutely alert, every nerve fiber tuned to Sarah's slightest movement. The flight progressed, the drone of the engines a steady backdrop to his mounting unease. After about an hour, Sarah stirred. "I'm just going to use the restroom," she whispered, her voice a little too light. Hank gave a non-committal grunt from beneath his cap. He felt her rise, heard the soft shuffle of her passing. As she walked down the aisle, he lifted his cap just enough to see. She didn't look back at him. As she passed Chad Olson's row, her hand, almost imperceptibly, brushed against his shoulder. A feather-light touch, but one that spoke volumes. Chad glanced up, a quick, shared look passing between them before Sarah continued to the back of the plane. Hank's breath caught in his throat. A few minutes later, she returned. Instead of walking straight back to her seat, she paused beside Chad's row. They exchanged low words, their heads close. Chad's hands, so casual, so familiar, settled on her lower back, just above her waist. He smiled. Sarah smiled back, a warm, genuine smile that Hank hadn't seen directed at him in a while. Not like this. It was a smile of shared intimacy, a secret language he was only just now learning to read. The world, the comfortable, solid world he had known, fractured. His 10-year marriage, a monument he had built with care and trust, was collapsing, not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating whimper, right there in the middle of a crowded airplane aisle. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. How could she do this to me, he thought, his mind racing, trying to catch up with the brutal reality unfolding before him. He desperately hoped this was some horrible, convoluted misunderstanding. He prayed that Chad Olson was on a different connecting flight, but fate, or perhaps simply Sarah, had other plans. When they boarded the small island hopper for the final leg to Nassau, Hank saw him again. Chad was a few rows behind them this time. Sarah, her stomach issues apparently resolved, settled comfortably into the window seat, gazing out at the deepening blue of the Caribbean. Hank said nothing, just stared straight ahead. The drive from the Nassau airport to the resort was long, winding through unfamiliar streets. Sarah was busy on her phone, typing rapidly. "Who are you texting?" Hank asked, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within him. "Just Mom and my sisters," she said, not looking up. The answer felt thin, stretched. They arrived at the resort, a beautiful sprawling place with white stucco walls and bougainvillea spilling over balconies. Their room was spacious, overlooking the turquoise ocean. The setting was everything they had planned for, everything they had dreamed of. Hank watched Sarah unpack, her movements precise and unhurried. He stood by the balcony, the warm salt air doing little to soothe his internal chill. He turned to her, a last desperate plea rising in his throat. "Do you realize how much I love you, Sarah?" She paused, a silk blouse half unfolded in her hands. She met his gaze, her eyes distant. "Of course, Hank," she said, her voice soft, devoid of conviction. He pressed on, a whisper of hope still clinging to him. "I know you would never do anything to hurt me or our wonderful marriage." He saw her flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. The air in the beautiful room suddenly felt very cold. Hank stumbled into the bathroom, the cool tiles a stark contrast to the burning in his chest. He leaned against the closed door, the soft click of the lock a small comfort in the sudden chaos of his mind. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized, his usual calm features replaced by a mask of disbelief. 10 years, 10 years of shared meals, quiet evenings, long drives, and whispered dreams. He had poured every ounce of himself into their marriage, believing it was built on a foundation of mutual trust and love. What had he done wrong? What had he missed? The question echoed, hollow and accusatory in the small tiled space. The resort, a symbol of their cherished tradition, now felt like a gilded cage. Over the next few days, the beautiful Bahamian sun did nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep within Hank. Sarah became a stranger, always just out of reach. Her phone, once an occasional accessory, was now an extension of her hand, checked constantly, often discreetly under the table or behind her back. Calls were taken with a hushed voice, often followed by her retreating to the balcony, or more frequently, making an excuse to go back to the room alone for a few minutes. "Just need to grab my sunglasses," she'd say, or "forgot my book upstairs." Hank watched her, his own silence a heavy weight. Each furtive glance at her screen, each hurried whisper, was another nail in the coffin of his perfect life. His heart, once so full of her, felt like a stone, sinking deeper with every passing hour. One afternoon, Sarah suggested a walk down the beach. The idea itself felt normal, a flicker of their old routine. But as they walked, the soft sand cushioning their steps, Hank noticed something else. Her phone was in her hand as usual, but the screen was dark. No notifications. He knew her habits. This was unusual. She kept glancing around, her shoulders a little hunched, her eyes scanning the horizon, then the palms. Uneasy, guarded. The easy conversation they once shared was gone, replaced by forced small talk and long silences. Hank stopped. He looked out at the impossibly blue water, then turned to her, his voice tight, careful. "Sarah," he began, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Is there something going on between you and that man from the plane?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. Sarah flinched, her eyes darting away from his, toward the distant waves. "What? No, Hank, don't be ridiculous. Why would you even ask that?" Her voice was thin, a little too sharp, a lie hanging in the warm, salty air. He said nothing, just kept looking at her, and she broke eye contact, staring at her feet. He started seeing Chad Olson everywhere. By the main pool, lounging on a chair near where Sarah had been just moments before. At the outdoor bar, sipping a drink, his eyes scanning the crowd, always subtly, almost imperceptibly, landing on Sarah. He was a constant, unsettling presence, a shadow at the edges of their forced normalcy. Hank never saw them together in public, but the pattern was undeniable. Chad was always there, always near. That evening, they went to one of the resort's fancier restaurants. Sarah made an effort, dressed in a light summer dress, her hair pulled back. She even left her phone in her purse, a deliberate act that Hank noted. He tried to engage her in conversation, to remember the feeling of sitting across from the woman he thought he knew. But every word felt hollow, every smile strained. A cold dread, heavier than any he had ever known, settled over him, coating his tongue, tightening his chest. He knew this was the calm before the storm. Back in the room, the night was thick with the sounds of the ocean and the hum of the air conditioning. Hank pretended to sleep, his breathing even and slow. Sarah moved quietly around the room, preparing for bed. Then, a soft buzz, her phone. She snatched it up, her movements quick, practiced. She glanced at the screen, then at Hank, ensuring he was still asleep. She padded silently to the balcony, her voice a low murmur. Hank strained to hear. "I'll meet you in 15 minutes, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the waves. Then a click. The call ended. She returned, slipped into bed, her back to him, feigning sleep. Hank waited. 5 minutes, then 6, then 7. He heard the faint rustle of her getting up, the soft click of the door closing. He counted to 10, then slowly, carefully, rose from the bed. His blood ran cold, a mixture of certainty and pure terror. He pulled on a t-shirt, sweatpants, and a pair of flip-flops. The hall was empty. He walked quickly, quietly, his bare feet making almost no sound on the cool tile floors. He knew where to look. There was a secluded stretch of beach, away from the main resort area, that they had discovered on a previous trip. The path was dimly lit by scattered lamps in the pale moonlight. He heard voices, hushed and intimate, before he saw them. Rounding a bend in the path, he stopped. There, beneath the shadow of a swaying palm tree, were Sarah and Chad Olson. They were locked in an embrace, kissing. Her arms were around his neck, his hands on her waist. It was unmistakable. Every quiet fear, every subtle sign, every sinking feeling coalesced into this single brutal image. A primal roar tore from Hank's throat. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He lunged. His fist connected with Chad's jaw, a sickening crunch that reverberated through his own bones. Chad staggered back, surprised, falling into the sand. Hank was on him, a blur of rage, another punch, then another, landing somewhere on Chad's chest, his shoulder. "Hank, stop! Please, stop!" Sarah's scream was shrill, cutting through the night. She grabbed his arm, pulling at him with surprising strength, yanking him back. Hank fought her, his vision red. She was yelling, pulling, her face a mask of fear. Chad scrambled up, clutching his jaw, his eyes wide with shock. He took a few steps back, then turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the resort grounds. Sarah was still clinging to Hank, trembling. He shook her off, his chest heaving, his hands balled into fists. He stared at her, the woman he had loved, his wife. Her face was streaked with tears, fear in her eyes. "Hank," she choked out, "I'm so sorry." Back in the sterile, quiet hotel room, she finally broke. Sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, she confessed, the words tumbling out in a broken whisper. "It's Chad. He teaches music at my school." The simple fact hit Hank harder than any punch, a colleague, someone from her everyday life. "It started 6 months ago," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Just talking at first, after school. Then, it just escalated. 6 months. Hank felt a profound, crushing sense of loss, deeper than just the betrayal. 6 months. While he was planning their future, talking about house renovations, thinking about baby names. While he was working, believing he was building a life for them both. The thought choked him. He walked to the balcony, staring out at the dark, indifferent ocean. He heard her soft sobs behind him. He didn't turn around. "You promised you'd never hurt me, Sarah," he whispered, the words heavy, tasting like ash in his mouth. The morning light, usually a welcome sight in their Bahamian retreat, felt harsh, exposing every imperfection in the resort room. The crisp white sheets, the polished wooden furniture, the vibrant art on the walls. Every surface seemed to hum with the weight of their shattered trust. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped, her face pale, the picture of remorse. Hank, meanwhile, felt a hollow, aching numbness. The rage from the night before had receded, leaving behind a cold, desolate landscape. He stared out at the ocean, the turquoise water still beautiful, but now tainted by betrayal. What now? Hank's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the question hanging heavy in the humid air between them. He didn't turn around. Sarah said nothing, only a quiet sob escaping her lips. More tears. He heard her sniffle, then the rustle of tissue. He waited, but no answer came. The silence was an answer in itself. A soft buzz vibrated against the bedside table. Sarah's phone. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, then quickly set it back down. Face down. A moment later, a soft rap echoed on their door. Hank knew. He walked slowly, deliberately across the room. He twisted the lock, pulling the heavy door open. Chad Olson stood there, a faint bruise blooming on his jaw, his eyes apprehensive. He swallowed hard. "Hank," he started, his voice a little shaky. "Look, I just wanted to apologize. I really messed up. This whole thing, it was wrong. I regret it." The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Hank looked at Chad, his gaze quiet, steady, but beneath it, a cold fury simmered. There was no genuine remorse in Chad's eyes, only a discomfort, a self-preservation. Hank stepped closer, his large frame filling the doorway. Chad instinctively recoiled. "You stay away from her," Hank said, his voice low, a controlled rumble. "You stay away from us. You don't want to see what happens next. Believe me." The threat hung unspoken in the air, a promise of consequences Chad did not want to explore. Chad nodded quickly, his eyes wide. "Got it. I understand. Won't happen again." He backed away, turning and disappearing down the corridor. Hank closed the door softly, the click of the lock feeling final. He turned to Sarah. Her eyes were red, swollen. "Hank, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I'll end it. I swear, I'll call him. Right now, I messed up, Hank. Please, forgive me. I love you." Her plea hung in the air, desperate and raw. Hank looked at her, searching for something, anything, in her tear-streaked face. But all he saw was the image of her in Chad's arms. The flight home was a suffocating descent into unspoken words. The tropical warmth gave way to the sharp, dry cold of a Minnesota winter. Sarah kept to her window, staring out at the frozen fields and leafless trees, the landscape offering no comfort. Hank sat beside her, silent, the hum of the jet engines a monotonous backdrop to his internal turmoil. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. The air between them was thick with shattered trust, each unspoken thought a fresh wound. Back in their comfortable St. Paul home, the Midwestern silence was deafening. The familiar sounds, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the distant hum of the furnace, the gentle creak of the old house, only amplified the emptiness. There were no accustomed cuddles on the couch, no shared plans for dinner, just an echoing void where their easy intimacy used to be. Every object, every photograph, felt like a silent witness into a perfect life that had been a lie. Hank felt the immense pressure of their close-knit community. How would he ever explain this? What would he tell their families, their friends, the people who had seen their marriage as an ideal? The weight of that future conversation felt heavier than any snowdrift. Sarah, in the days that followed, tried. Small gestures, almost imperceptible. She cooked his favorite meals, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, creamy chicken hottish. She'd leave his coffee warming on the counter in the morning. Sometimes she'd reach out, a tentative hand brushing his arm, a soft touch on his shoulder. But Hank instinctively pulled away. A wall had risen between them, unseen but impenetrable, built of betrayal and doubt. He could feel her desperation, her sorrow, but he couldn't reach past it. Not yet. He spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, the quiet house amplifying the racing thoughts in his head. He replayed every conversation, every casual interaction, every missed glance. How had he been so blind? What signs had he missed? The shame of his ignorance burned just as fiercely as the anger. One evening, Sarah, her voice hesitant, suggested marriage counseling. "Maybe we could talk to someone, Hank, just to try and sort through this." Hank listened, but his gut clenched. Counseling. For what? To fix something that felt fundamentally broken? He was hesitant, feeling it was too late for a simple fix. The cracks were too deep. He needed to talk to someone who understood the quiet codes of their world. He called Joe, his best friend and fellow contractor. They met at Joe's garage, surrounded by tools and the smell of sawdust and oil. Hank laid it all out, the raw, brutal details, his voice low and even, devoid of the emotion he felt. Joe listened, his face grim, not interrupting, just occasionally nodding. No platitudes, no judgment, just unwavering, silent support. The kind a man in their town offered when things were truly bad. A few days later, Sarah's parents called. "How was the wonderful trip to the Bahamas?" her mother chirped, her voice oblivious. Hank listened as Sarah gave vague, positive answers, her voice carefully modulated. "It was lovely, Mom. Just what we needed. Lots of sun." He hung up the phone, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. The secret. It was a burden only he truly carried, heavy as a winter snow, threatening to bury them both. Weeks bled into months. The house, once a warm, inviting space, became a hollow shell. Hank and Sarah moved through it like ghosts, inhabiting the same rooms but rarely truly connecting. The frayed threads of their marriage were stretched taut, holding together a facade that fooled no one but themselves, and perhaps not even that. Every morning, the clatter of breakfast dishes felt like a performance. Every evening, the television provided a flimsy screen behind which they could hide from each other. Hank found a grim solace in work. The cold bite of a Minnesota winter meant fewer outdoor projects, but there was always planning, always the meticulous detail of blueprints, the heavy lifting of materials. He liked the straightforwardness of it, the tangible progress. A wall was built, a foundation poured, a problem solved. There was no ambiguity, no hidden meanings, unlike the mess his home life had become. Physical exhaustion was a welcome antidote to the churning in his gut. Sarah, too, was a shadow of her former self. The bright spark that usually defined her teaching, the genuine joy she found in music, seemed to have dimmed. Her colleagues, ever observant in their small town, noticed. "Sarah seems a little quiet lately," Mrs. Henderson, the art teacher, had commented to Hank at the grocery store. Hank had just grunted, mumbled something about winter blues. He knew it was guilt, a heavy cloak she wore, visible to those who knew her well. One Tuesday morning, as Hank was finishing his coffee, he overheard Sarah on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, hushed. "I just need to talk to a friend," she murmured into the receiver. "Things are difficult. I just need to get some perspective." A cold knot formed in Hank's stomach. A friend. He knew that word, that inflection. It was the same way she had talked about Chad. He felt a familiar surge of dread. When she hung up, Hank moved into the kitchen. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice calm, flat. Sarah flinched, startled. "Oh, Hank, just Mary, from school." She avoided his gaze, busying herself with wiping down the already clean counter. He didn't press it. He just watched her. Later that evening, the phone rang again. Sarah answered it, her back to Hank. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I told you no. It's over. I just need some time." She hung up abruptly. She turned to him, tears welling in her eyes. "It was Chad," she confessed, her voice thick. "He called, but I didn't meet him, Hank. I told him it's over." Hank looked at her, searching her face for a truth he desperately wanted to find. The trust was fractured, broken into a million tiny pieces. "How can I know that for sure, Sarah?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. She just shook her head, tears streaming. The idea of separation began to fester, a painful, constant ache in his gut. He pushed it down, tried to ignore it, but it kept surfacing, a dark whisper in the quiet hours of the night. Their beautiful house, the symbol of their shared life, now felt like a prison. Sarah, sensing his withdrawal, became more desperate. Small notes would appear on his pillow, little messages of regret and love. She'd leave a small gift on his workbench. A new pair of work gloves, a thermos. She tried to rekindle intimacy, a tentative hand on his arm in the evening, a brush against his leg under the table. But Hank remained distant, his heart armored, unwilling to let himself be vulnerable again. Every touch felt like a ghost, a reminder of what was lost. The plans for a family, once so vibrant and real, now felt impossible. How could they bring a child into this? The thought was a painful reminder of the future they had been building, now shattered. They attended a town fundraiser, a necessary public appearance. They smiled, they nodded, they made polite conversation with their neighbors. Hank felt the strain of the mask they both wore, a heavy, suffocating weight. He saw the polite glances, the subtle observations from people who had known them for years. They were playing a part, and it was exhausting. A few weeks later, on a brisk Tuesday morning, Sarah called in sick from school. Hank was heading out to meet a client, a job estimate for a new garage. As he drove past their quiet street, heading out of town, he saw it. Sarah's car, parked 2 blocks away, tucked carefully behind a thick hedge. A bad feeling, cold and sharp, rose in his chest. His gut clenched. He canceled his appointment. He drove past the house again, slowly, then turned around, finding a spot down the street where he could watch. He waited. After about an hour, Sarah emerged from the house, got into her car, and drove away. Hank followed, keeping a few cars between them. She drove out of St. Paul, heading east, to a smaller neighboring town, finally pulling into the parking lot of a quiet coffee shop on Main Street. Hank parked his truck a block away, out of sight. He watched as Sarah walked inside. A few minutes later, Chad Olson entered, his head down, looking around cautiously. He sat down at Sarah's table. Hank watched them through the plate glass window. They talked, their heads close, their body language suggesting a painful but still intimate connection. Chad reached across the table, his hand briefly covering hers. Hank felt a wave of nausea. He waited until they left, watching Chad walk one way, Sarah the other. He drove home slowly, the anger a cold, hard knot in his gut. That evening, after Sarah had made a quiet dinner, chicken and wild rice casserole, one of his favorites, he finally confronted her. He put his fork down, his eyes fixed on her. "You said it was over, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet, dangerously calm. "What was that at the coffee shop today?" Sarah froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, her face drained of color. She dropped the fork with a clatter. "Hank, I just needed to talk to him, to get closure." Her voice was barely a whisper. Hank felt the last sliver of hope, the fragile possibility of a future, crumble into dust like dry earth. The last sliver of hope had crumbled, leaving Hank with a stark clarity. He sat at the kitchen table, the casserole untouched. "Sarah," he said, his voice quiet, steady, "Chad has to be completely out of your life. No calls, no coffee, no closure, not a single thing. Or I'm leaving. There's no compromise left." The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Sarah stared at him, her face etched with despair. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time Hank felt no softening. "Hank, no," she choked out. "Please, I'll do it. I swear on our future. I'll cut all ties completely. Just, just don't leave." Her voice trembled, raw with desperation. Hank watched her, weighing her words against the memory of her in Chad's arms. He let out a slow breath. "All right," he said, the word heavy with unspoken conditions. "One more time." The effort felt forced, a fragile agreement hovering in the brittle silence between them. He could see her relief, but it was overshadowed by his own profound sense of weariness. The small-town nature of St. Paul meant Chad and Sarah were still colleagues. Hank knew this, and it gnawed at him. They taught in the same school, walked the same hallways. How could complete separation truly happen? The thought was a constant irritant, a pebble in his shoe. He knew it was unavoidable, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. He met Joe for coffee a few days later, trying to project a semblance of normalcy. He told Joe about the ultimatum, the agreement. Joe listened, stirring his coffee. "Hank," he said, his voice low, "you're a good man, but don't be a fool twice. Protect yourself, legally, emotionally. You deserve that." Hank nodded, the words sinking in, sharp and true. He knew Joe was right. A new vigilance settled over Hank. He started checking Sarah's phone when she left it unattended, scrolling through her call logs, her messages. He looked at her social media, searched for anything, any subtle sign. He found nothing overt, no suspicious texts, no hidden calls. But this lack of evidence, paradoxically, only heightened his paranoia. It meant she was being careful, more clever. It fed the deep-seated doubt that now consumed him. Their 10th anniversary was approaching. 10 years. It was once a joyous milestone, a testament to their enduring love, a day they always celebrated with intention. Now it was a painful reminder of what they had and what they had lost. The date felt like a mocking echo of a past that no longer existed. Sarah, ever the planner, suggested a quiet dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. Hank agreed, going along with the motions. He chose his words carefully, offering polite affirmations, but his heart wasn't in it. Every shared glance, every attempt at light conversation felt like a performance for an invisible audience. At dinner, Sarah presented him with a gift, a framed photograph from their honeymoon. A younger, happier Hank and Sarah smiling at the camera, their arms wrapped around each other on a beach in Hawaii. It was a sentimental gesture, meant to evoke longing for what they had. Hank felt a pang of guilt, then a wave of resentment. It felt like a manipulation. He looked at the photo, then at her, forcing a small smile. His gift to her was terse, honest. "I'm still here, trying," he said, handing her a small, neatly wrapped box containing a silver pendant he had bought weeks ago, before everything shattered. It felt inadequate, a poor substitute for the words he couldn't bring himself to say. Later, over dessert, Sarah brought up a topic that had been off limits for months. "Hank," she began, her voice soft, tentative, "what about our plans for children? We talked about it so much before." Hank felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He avoided her gaze, focusing on the rim of his wineglass. "I don't know, Sarah," he mumbled, his voice flat. The thought of bringing a child into this brokenness, into a home built on such shaky ground, was too much to bear. One afternoon, Hank found himself at the local hardware store picking up some bolts for a fence project. As he turned a corner in the lumber aisle, he stopped dead. Chad Olson was standing there, examining a stack of 2x4s. Chad looked up, saw Hank, and a fake, casual smile spread across his face. "Hank," he said, a little too loudly, a little too cheerily. Hank said nothing. He simply held Chad's gaze, his eyes conveying a silent, menacing warning. No words were needed. The message was clear. Chad's smile faltered, then disappeared. His bravado visibly deflated. He dropped the lumber he was holding, muttering a quick "excuse me," and practically bolted from the aisle, leaving his cart behind. Hank watched him go, a grim satisfaction mingling with the familiar taste of bitter resentment. In the weeks that followed, Sarah started staying late at school. Extra work, she'd say, helping students with their recital, or a late faculty meeting. The excuses piled up. Hank's suspicions reignited, a familiar coldness spreading through him. He found himself thinking, "Here we go again." He decided he needed more than gut feelings. He checked their joint bank statements. He scrolled through months of transactions, looking for anything unusual, any small, hidden expense. A pit began to form in his stomach as he saw a pattern emerge. Several small, recurring charges from a flower shop in a neighboring town, one he didn't recognize, and then a few larger purchases from a local jewelry store, a place they had never shopped at together. This story of quiet desperation and simmering suspicion is far from over. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The small, unexplained withdrawals from their joint account had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly, a few $100s here, another 100 there, spread out over the past few months. Then, the larger purchases from the jewelry store, followed by more small cash transfers. Hank sat at his desk, staring at the printed bank statements, the numbers blurring, then sharpening, into a stark pattern of deceit. A cold pit formed in his stomach, a familiar, sickening sensation. He then pulled up their shared cell phone bill. Scrolling through the detailed usage, he found an unfamiliar number, recurring frequently. Calls lasting mere minutes, then a flurry of texts, often clustered around the times Sarah claimed to be working late or helping students. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he cross-referenced the number. A quick search online confirmed it. Chad Olson. The name appeared on the screen, cold and undeniable. The truth hit Hank not with the shock of discovery, but with the brutal force of a renewed betrayal. She had lied again. Not just a momentary lapse, not just a weak attempt at closure on men, but a continuous, calculated deception, stretching over weeks, perhaps months, since their return from the Bahamas. The anger that had been simmering, kept carefully banked, now roared to life, a cold, searing flame. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate choice, repeated, sustained. It was unforgivable. His mind, once clouded by doubt and pain, pain, was now clear precise. He gathered the evidence, the printed bank statements, the highlighted phone records. His hands were steady as he stacked the papers, a strange calm settling over him, born of absolute certainty. He knew what he had to do. That evening, Sarah came home, oblivious. The door opened and closed, a soft thud. He heard her humming a light tune, the melody familiar from her piano students. "Hank, you home?" she called out, her voice bright. She walked into the kitchen, shedding her coat, her eyes falling on him sitting at the kitchen table. "Long day?" she asked, her voice solicitous. "How was your meeting with the client?" He didn't answer. He simply gestured to the kitchen table. The stark white papers neatly laid out were waiting. The figures, the dates, the names. "Explain this, Sarah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. Sarah looked at the papers, then at him, her face usually so expressive when utterly blank. She picked up a sheet, her eyes scanning the transactions, then the phone log. A slow, creeping realization spread across her features, draining all color from her cheeks. "Hank, it's not what you think," she stammered, her voice thin. "I can explain." She tried to deflect, tried to invent a story, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at the evidence, then at his unyielding gaze and crumbled. The full confession, when it came, was a torrent of shame and regret. Yes, the secret meetings had continued. Yes, the texts, the calls, the late nights at school were often spent elsewhere. And the money. He was having some financial trouble, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He lost a teaching grant. He needed help. I felt bad. Financial gifts to Chad for his troubles. The words hung in the air, a final sickening blow. Hank felt a profound, absolute breakage. It wasn't just a crack or a fracture. It was a complete shattering. The love he had held for her, the trust he had so desperately tried to rebuild, the future they had meticulously planned, all of it shattered beyond repair, like splintered wood, impossible to piece back together. The image of her helping Chad financially while lying to him felt like a final insult. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her bent head. His voice was low, steady, and chilling, each word distinct, sharp. "Get out of my house, Sarah. Now." She looked up, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Hank, no, please. This is my home too. Where will I go?" she pleaded, her voice rising, bordering on hysteria. He pointed to the stack of evidence, his gaze unyielding, cold. Not anymore. Not with him. He didn't need to elaborate. The implication was clear. She couldn't claim this home while actively building another life, another relationship with another man. Defeated, her body language shrinking into itself, Sarah slowly rose from the table. She walked mechanically to their bedroom, the room they had shared for so long. Hank listened to the rustle of clothes, the quiet opening and closing of drawers. When she emerged a few minutes later, she clutched a small duffel bag, her face streaked with tears, her world falling apart. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a carefully planned demolition. The taillights of Sarah's car glowed a defiant red against the dark, frozen asphalt of their driveway, then vanished, swallowed by the cold Midwestern night. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, and absolute. Hank stood at the window watching, until the last echo of her departure faded. He was alone in the house that had been their home, the place where they had built 10 years of a shared life. He walked through the rooms, the familiar spaces now feeling hollow, sterile, utterly devoid of warmth. The kitchen, where they'd planned so many meals, stood silent. The living room, where they'd curled up on the couch, was cold. The piano, Sarah's pride and Shorboy, sat dormant in the corner, a silent monument to a broken dream. Every object, every memory was tainted by the betrayal. The quiet intimacy that had once filled these walls was gone, replaced by an echoing emptiness. Hank picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Joe's number. He took a deep breath, the air cold in his lungs, and dialed. When Joe answered, Hank's voice was raw, strained, stripped bare of pretense. "She's gone, Joe." He didn't need to say more. Joe understood. Within 20 minutes, Hank heard the familiar rumble of Joe's pickup in the driveway. Joe came in, didn't say much, just sat down at the kitchen table, offering a silent, steadfast presence. He poured them both a glass of water, a simple gesture of quiet support. "Get to a lawyer first thing in the morning, Hank," Joe said, his voice low, firm. "Protect yourself. Don't waste another minute. This ain't just about feelings now." Hank nodded. He knew Joe was right. The emotional damage was done. Now it was time for the practical, painful unraveling. The news, like wildfire and dry grass, began to spread through their small St. Paul community. Sarah Peterson, the beloved music teacher, had moved out of Hank Miller's house. Even a temporary departure was enough to ignite the rumor mill. Whispers at the grocery store, hushed conversations after church, knowing glances at the school pickup line. Hank felt the weight of it, the unspoken questions, the speculation. Sarah, as Hank later learned, had moved in with her sister, Mary. This created its own tension. Mary, fiercely protective of Sarah, but also pragmatic, was caught between her sister's pain and the undeniable truth of the situation. Hushed conversations filled Mary's usually boisterous home, the easy comfort replaced by an undercurrent of awkwardness. First thing in the morning, Hank followed Joe's advice. He met with a local attorney, a shrewd, quiet man named Mr. Thompson, who had handled many such cases in their community. Hank, his resolve like granite, laid out the facts: the affair, the repeated lies, the financial discrepancies. He handed over the printed statements, the phone records, the timeline of betrayal. Mr. Thompson listened, taking notes, his face impassive. The lawyer explained the financial implications, the equitable division of their shared assets, their home, their savings, and then the more complex issue of Sarah's pension, a significant asset earned over years of teaching, now potentially impacted by the financial infidelity. The calculations, the legal jargon, felt detached, almost surreal given the emotional wreckage, but Hank knew it was necessary. When Sarah received the legal papers delivered by a quiet courier to Mary's house, she was shocked. Her call to Hank was immediate, her voice laced with accusation, tinged with disbelief. "How could you do this to me, Hank? After everything? You're being vindictive." Hank's reply was cold, steady, unwavering. "You did this, Sarah, not me." He hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction, a flicker of strength returning. The fallout extended beyond their immediate circle. Chad Olson's professional reputation at the school, once stellar, began to suffer. Rumors and whispers, fueled by the small-town grapevine, circulated like weeds. Parents started asking questions, subtly at first, then more directly. Chad found himself increasingly isolated, his easy charm now seen through a lens of suspicion. Sarah's parents, loyal and distressed, intervened. They called Hank, their voices pleading, trying to mediate. "Hank," her father began, "we know you are hurting, but you two had something special. Think of the good times. Can't you just reconsider? Talk this out?" Her mother echoed the sentiment. "Families work through things, Hank. We love you both." But Hank stood firm. He explained patiently, coldly, the repeated betrayals, the affair on vacation, the second chance he'd given her, the continued deception, the financial drain. He didn't raise his voice, but his resolve was clear, unyielding. "I gave her every chance. She chose this path." The conversations were difficult, painful, but Hank held his ground. He reflected on the true cost of Sarah's choices. It wasn't just the emotional devastation, the shattering of his own trust and love. It was the financial implications, the legal battles that lay ahead, the public humiliation, the reputational damage to all involved. It was a cost that would ripple through their lives, through their small town, for a long time to come. The legal process for their divorce, like a stubborn Midwestern winter, dragged on, grinding forward with a slow, relentless pace. It was painful and draining, a constant, unwelcome harvest of paperwork and financial disclosures, each document a reminder of what was lost. Hank attended every meeting, his demeanor calm, his resolve firm, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. The tight-knit social fabric of their small town, once a source of comfort, now felt like a suffocating net. Friends, caught in the uncomfortable crosscurrents, chose sides or kept their distance, unwilling to take part in the drama. Invitations stopped coming. The calls dwindled. She saw the glances, felt the chill. Chad Olson's situation at the school deteriorated rapidly. Formal complaints were filed, not just by Hank, but by concerned parents and even some colleagues who had witnessed his questionable conduct. Eventually, he lost his job. The official reason cited was conduct unbecoming a teacher, a polite euphemism for the scandal. Within weeks, Chad packed his bags, selling his small house and disappearing from town, unable to withstand the scrutiny and professional repercussions. The house, their home, the very foundation of their life had to be sold. It was a mutual decision, a practical necessity, but it felt like the final severing of ties, a symbol of broken dreams. Hank walked through it one last time before the closing, the empty rooms echoing his own sense of loss, but also, surprisingly, a burgeoning sense of peace. Hank, in the quiet hours and the busy days, slowly started to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his business, expanding his client base, taking on larger projects. He found new hobbies, taking up woodworking in his garage, the precise work a welcome distraction. He was slowly, painstakingly tending to his own field, clearing out the weeds, preparing for new growth. One afternoon, Sarah appeared at his office, unannounced. She looked tired, thinner, her once bright eyes now shadowed. "Hank," she began, her voice small, tentative. "Can we talk, please? Just one last time." She tried to appeal to their past, to the decade they had shared. "Don't you remember everything we had?" Hank listened, his heart still wounded, but his resolve was firm. He explained, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Sarah, too much trust has been broken. Too many lines crossed. There's no going back. Not for me." He could see the devastation in her eyes, the true weight of his words finally sinking in. He realized the infidelity hadn't just broken his heart. It had fundamentally changed his perception of love and commitment. The unquestioning belief he once held in the sanctity of marriage was gone, replaced by a cautious skepticism. It was a wound that would heal, but the scar would always remain. A few months after the house sold, a glimmer of hope began to appear. Hank started to date casually, cautiously. A dinner with a woman from a neighboring town, met through a mutual friend, a movie night with another. He was testing the waters of a new future, like a tentative spring thaw, hesitant but full of potential. He was learning to trust again, slowly, and most importantly, learning to trust himself. Sarah, away from the immediate heat of the affair, away from Chad, away from the life she had so carelessly thrown away, truly began to understand the gravity of her actions. Not just the loss of Hank, but the loss of her entire stable life, her home, her reputation, her place in a community that had once embraced her. It was a heavy truth, a bitter pill. She grappled with her own morality, the price she had paid for fleeting passion, the cost now etched deeply on her soul. Chad, true to his word, never returned to St. Paul. He disappeared, his life now somewhere out in the wider world, a faint memory. The final hearing for their divorce was a somber affair. Hank sat beside Mr. Thompson, Sarah on the other side of the room with her own lawyer. It was a sterile, definitive end, signed and sealed by a judge. No fanfare, no drama, just the quiet click of a pen and the rustle of papers. The assets were divided according to the court's order. The financial cost of the affair, of the divorce, of the lawyer's fees, was now plainly evident to Sarah. The shared savings depleted, the house equity split, the pension adjustments. It was a stark numerical representation of the choices she had made. A few weeks later, Hank stood on the porch of the now sold house one last time, waiting for the new owners to arrive. He looked out over the familiar Midwestern landscape, the bare trees, the distant fields, the gray winter sky. It was a quiet vista, unchanging. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and felt a quiet resolve settle within him. It was time to turn the page. Months had bled into a year since Sarah drove away from their St. Paul home. Hank had moved into a smaller, simpler house on the edge of town, a place that felt more manageable, less burdened by ghosts. He focused intently on his contracting business, finding a new rhythm in the steady demands of building and repairing. His days were filled with the tangible satisfaction of work well done, the smell of sawdust and fresh paint, a comforting constant. His evenings were quiet but no longer empty. He found satisfaction in reading, in long walks by the Mississippi, in the deliberate work of tending to his own field. New routines had taken root. Saturday mornings were for coffee with Joe, discussing business, local politics, the quiet hum of their lives. Sundays were for rest, for contemplation, for the occasional fishing trip. The town, in its own slow, Midwestern way, eventually moved on. The whispers about Hank and Sarah, once so pervasive, faded into memory, replaced by new gossip, new daily concerns. Hank cautiously rebuilt his social connections, not with the intensity of before, but with a deeper, more discerning eye. Sarah's new reality was a stark contrast to her old life. She lived in a different town, a few hours west, working a less prestigious job, teaching at a smaller, more rural school. The weight of her choices was palpable, a constant companion in her quiet existence. Her life, once so vibrant and promising, had shrunk, reduced to the necessities, stripped bare of the comfortable illusion she had once enjoyed. One Saturday afternoon, Hank was at a grocery store in a nearby town, picking up supplies for a project. As he pushed his cart down an aisle, he saw her, Sarah. She was standing by the produce section, examining a head of lettuce, her back to him. She looked different, older than her years, a little stooped, her usually bright hair dulled. There was a haunted quality to her, a shadow of her former self. He saw the way she moved, the careful, almost hesitant steps. He stopped, hidden behind a display of cereal boxes, watching them. She didn't look up, didn't seem to sense his presence. The chasm between them, carved out by betrayal and shattered trust, was too wide, too deep to cross. There was nothing left to say, no interaction possible. He simply watched her for a moment, then turned his cart and moved in the opposite direction, leaving her undisturbed. In the quiet solitude of his new life, Hank often reflected on the painful lessons learned: betrayal, trust, resilience. They were etched into his experience, not as open wounds, but as hardened lines, like the grooves carved into old timber. He realized that true forgiveness for Sarah wasn't necessary for his own healing. What was necessary, what had truly set him free, was letting go of the anger, shedding it like a heavy winter coat, allowing himself to move forward unburdened. The scars remained, a permanent reminder of the lightning strike that had changed his life. He felt them, sometimes a dull ache in his chest, a fleeting memory of the man he once was. But they no longer defined him. They were part of his story, not the whole of it. Hank found a deeper appreciation for authenticity and integrity in relationships, clear-eyed and steady, unwilling to settle for anything less than genuine connection. He was open to love again, but with a guarded wisdom, knowing now the inherent fragility of trust, the ease with which it could be broken. He carried the quiet strength of the Midwest, enduring hardship and slowly, surely rebuilding, like the land itself after a long, hard winter. A few months after seeing Sarah at the grocery store, he received a call from Mary, Sarah's sister. It wasn't a call for reconciliation, but a quiet update, a somber echo. Mary spoke of Sarah's struggles, the quiet difficulty of her new life, the loneliness. Hank listened, his heart neither hardened nor softened, but simply accepting. He understood the full, long-term price Sarah paid for her infidelity, a cost far beyond the divorce papers, a lifetime of consequence for choices made in a moment of weakness and deceit. Hank stood on the porch of his smaller, simpler home, the spring sun warm on his face, a light breeze rustling the nascent leaves on the trees. He looked out at the open horizon, the familiar Midwestern landscape stretching out before him. The past was behind him, a chapter closed. He was a man changed but not broken. He was ready for whatever the future held.